Can everybody hear okay?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, Ayacheke, Tepewe Neolaka Koke, Andy Sawyer Waynes Wiane, Mekim Wiane Myaamia Nipwayana Kaninge, Myaamia Misha Nipwanda Kaninge. Did you get all that? Yeah. All right. Well, hello everyone. It's good to see you here this afternoon. My name's Andy Sawyer. I work at the Myaamia Center at Miami University. I just introduced myself in Myaamia Tribe, the Miami language, the language of the citizens of the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma. While I introduced myself in the language, and while I work at the center with mostly citizens of the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma, I am not a citizen of the tribe. I'm not native. But very much appreciate the opportunity to work with one of the 574 tribal nations in the U.S. To share the work that they are doing. So I want to thank Brian for inviting me to come in today. We've been planning this for several months now. And I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the history of the tribe and also their relationship with Miami University, which we like to say now goes back a ways, but in a lot of ways it doesn't go back that far. To give you a little background on myself, I grew up just north of here in the thriving metropolis of McGonigal. So, McGonagillians unite. Got my undergraduate at Miami University. I went to graduate school at the University of Denver, which I only bring up because I've got Ken sitting here in the front row with his Ohio State 9 national championships hat on. But I'm taking you down, son, because last spring the University of Denver won their 10th national title in hockey. So, got you by one. Had anybody ever heard of the Myaamia Center before today by chance? Several have? Several haven't? Okay. So the center was established on campus in 2001 after tribal leaders from Oklahoma came to Oxford. They had begun this language revitalization process in the 1990s. And as it got underway, the demand for it really took off. By the late 1990s, there were really no citizens of the tribe who knew their language. There was no one speaking the language. If you've seen some of the news stories in the last several years, you've probably seen some stories about the history of boarding schools. So the process of forcing Native children into boarding schools was a process of taking their culture away from them, including their language. And so by the time we get to the 1990s, a lot of tribes were at the point where they really had no speakers of the language left. Some folks, yeah, they may have known a few words that their parents or grandparents had passed along to them, but nobody really spoke the language. So they get this process going. In the 90s, the demand from the tribe just takes off. And pretty quickly, the tribe recognizes we need help. This is becoming a big project. And so leaders from the tribe visited Oxford, met with university administrators, said, we've got this language revitalization effort going, we could use help, will you help us? And the reason they came to Oxford to ask for this help, as we'll get into as we go through this discussion, is that at that point they had an almost 30-year relationship with the university, and they felt very comfortable working with them. And the university agreed, said, yeah, we'll help you with this. We'll fund one position and see how it goes. So at that point, they hired Daryl Baldwin, who was still the director of the Myaamia Center, and said, see what you can do. And so I was just talking with a few folks before we got started here. So from Daryl, the one guy, in 2001 when the center was founded, today we have, I think, 20 full and part-time staff at the center working on multiple aspects of cultural revitalization for the citizens of the Myaamia tribe. It really started with that focus on language, but has expanded greatly to many other aspects of culture. And we'll hit on some of that as we go through as well. Matame, Myaamionki, Nipingonje, Sakachewecheke. At the first, the Myamis, out of the water they came. These are the opening lines to the oldest story the citizens of the tribe remember, that they still tell today. This is what they refer to as their coming out story. It's not a creation story, but it's a story about how they came into this landscape that became their homelands. So we are here today in the original homelands of the Myaami people and several other tribal nations. So with this story, they talk about coming into Myaamionki, the place of the Myamis, the homelands of the Myamis. This map shows those homelands. While it may not have some of the things you might be used to seeing on modern maps, like roads, state boundaries, international boundaries, is there anything on there that helps you kind of place where all of this is? Great Lakes, Illinois, Mississippi River, Ohio River, Scioto River. So when we look at this map, we're really looking at all of what would become the state of Illinois, all of what would become the state of Indiana, western half of Ohio, a little bit up into Michigan, a good chunk of southern Wisconsin, a little bit up into Ontario maybe, with the western edge of Lake Erie right here. But this coming out story, depending on who's telling the story, some folks will tell it as if folks are in canoes, they're in boats on the water. Some folks will tell it as if they're swimming, so they're making their way, swimming through the water. And as they approach the bank, they close in on the bank and they see branches from trees hanging down over the water. And they tell each other, grab the branches, pull yourselves up onto the land. And that is how they came into this landscape. The place where they came out, so Sakachewecheke, out of the water they came, Sakiweyonge is the coming out place. This locate, we're not entirely sure about the location of this. So the dot on the map where this is located right here is pretty much South Bend, Indiana today. So it's along the St. Joseph River, somewhere between South Bend and where that river comes into Lake Michigan, that this coming out took place. As the story continues, from there they moved south, settling primarily down the Wabash River Valley, multiple villages up and down there. And they had left that coming out place, Sakiweyonge, and at some point they went back there and found somebody else there. They didn't know who they were. And they left, and those other folks left, and they didn't know where they went. So maybe this was the place for multiple communities coming into this landscape. But they never really went back and lived there. Today they recognize that area along the St. Joseph River and up into Michigan as the lands of the Potawatomi. So they recognize other communities living in that area. But they spread out down the Wabash River into this area, and there had never really been a visual representation of this story until about a decade or so ago. Tribal artist named Katrina Mitten, she's a beadworker. She wanted to give a visual presentation to this coming out story. So she beaded this vest. And you can see surface of the water, people swimming in the water, branches of the trees hanging down. So that was really kind of that first visual representation of this story of how they arrived into this landscape. They came from somewhere else. They're not sure where they came from. In fact, Myaamia, their traditional name for themselves, which is what we have corrupted into Miami today. Myaamia means the downstream people. Where they were coming downstream from, they're not sure. But it may have something to do with this coming out story and why they were in the water coming from somewhere to begin with, but they don't know exactly where that place was that they were coming from. So tribal leaders appreciated Katrina's vest so much that they took that design and kind of reworked it, and it is now the backdrop of the tribal council house out in Myaamia, Oklahoma. So that, standing in front of that is Chief Doug Langford, current chief of the Myaamia Tribe. And they also, if you notice, kind of in the background, you see the tree branch, you see the waves on the water, you see the people swimming. Written in the background of that is the entire coming out story in the Myaamia language, in Myaamionki. So whenever they gather, that origin story of coming into their homelands is right there for everyone to see. So Myaamionki, their homelands, was not strictly theirs. It was not exclusively Miami. This is a landscape they shared with multiple tribal nations. So on the east, in our area, they shared it with the Shawnees. To the north, the Ottawas, Ojibways, Potawatomis and others. To the west, the Kaskaskias and Peorias. So they very much refer to this as a shared landscape. But this red oval here, basically covering that Wabash River Valley, while all of this they refer to as the homelands, this they refer to as the heartlands. So see, most of those dots where those villages are located in that area. So that's where most of the population lived, that's where most of the main villages were. But they shared the rest of that landscape with the rest of these tribal nations. The blue dot on here is Oxford. So we can see we're kind of down in the southeast corner of these traditional homelands for the Miami people. But this remained the homeland for all of these communities till 1795. Does anybody know what happened in 1795 that impacted the Treaty of Greenville, 1795. Following a series of military conflicts, 1780s, early 1790s, coming out of the American Revolution. Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783 to end the Revolutionary War. The United States was broke. I mean, they didn't really have, the Articles of Confederation didn't give them a system to tax, raise much money. They took out a lot of loans from France and the Dutch to get through the war. But they come out of that in the mid-1780s, over $40 million in debt. Over $40 million in 1780 dollars. So I don't even know what that translates to today. But heavily in debt. So not only are they over $40 million in monetary debt, but they're also indebted to the people who signed up to fight in that revolution. Because a lot of the colonies, now states, had promised their residents, if you fight with us, we don't really have any money to pay you, but if we win this war, we'll promise you land. They were promising them land they didn't have to give them. But the land they were looking at was Myaamionki, these homelands. What the United States was calling the Northwest Territory. So in 1787, the passage of the Northwest Ordinance, the United States had laid out a plan for how they were going to settle and divide up this territory that they did not own. So they needed a way to get it. A series of military conflicts, 1780s and 90s. The Miamis, Shawnees, Delawares led this indigenous confederation that kept pushing back against American incursions into their homelands. Folks, U.S. citizens were not supposed to go north of the Ohio River and settle in these lands. The U.S. promised these native nations, we will not let folks come in and settle on your land. And people kept doing it. Native people kept pushing back. The United States then kept defending those people. So in 1790, President Washington, Secretary of War Henry Knox, they charged General Josiah Harmar with heading north up to this area. The black dot with the red in the center here, that's Fort Wayne, Indiana, was the site of the largest Miami village of Kikayonga, which was really kind of the center of the native resistance during this period. And so Washington and Knox charged Harmar, hey, head north to the villages on the Wabash and end this native resistance. So he puts together a militia, about 1,400 soldiers. They head north to find those villages abandoned because native scouts knew they were coming. They saw them. They abandoned their villages. Harmar and his troops burned those villages, burned their supplies of food. They described burning 10 to 20,000 bushels of corn in and around these villages. And all of a sudden, here comes the alliance. And they beat the snot out of Harmar and his troops. They lost their villages, they lost their food, but they held on to their land. So Harmar and company make their way back to Fort Washington, Cincinnati. Fort Washington was built in 1789, I think just the year before that. And they realized, well, that didn't work. So Washington and Knox charge Arthur St. Clair, the governor of the Northwest Territory, the next year, 1791. Go put together a militia, pull together some troops, head north, and end this resistance by native people. Okay, get about 1,400 troops. They're planning to make their way back to the Wabash. They get up right about here to a place called Fort Recovery. And they have hit the Wabash River, but have not made it up to where all the villages are, but they're kind of confused where they are. So they camp, and the Confederacy, led by the Miamis, the Shawnees, and the Delawares, throttle them. They are pretty quickly handed the worst defeat that the U.S. Army will ever experience at the hands of native people. They go up with about 1,400 troops. 625 or so are killed. 250 or so are injured. So of the 1,400, 900 or so are killed or injured, with 50 to 100 casualties on the native side. So they make their way back to Fort Washington. Military inquiries follow. What kind of bad leadership was it? They're not giving credit to the native people for their skill in taking out the Americans. They're saying, God, what did we do wrong? Well, you went up against a superior force is what you did wrong. So, I mean, the lack of recognition of native planning in this is what led to what we typically call these battles, or Harmar's defeat and St. Clair's defeat, laying the blame on them and not giving credit to the native folks who campaigned against them. More and more these days, we talk about the battle in 1790 as the Battle of Kikayonga, and the battle in 1791 as the Battle of the Wabash, recognizing that there were two sides on this fight, and one of them outplanned the other one. So recognizing this second defeat, Washington and Knox decide, well, okay, that one didn't work either. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our time. We're not going to march right back up there in 1792. We're going to hire a new general. We're going to plan this out a little better. We're going to, as part of St. Clair's campaign, 1791, Fort Hamilton was built. So we're going to repair and stock those forts, even build new ones between here and the Wabash villages. And we're going to raise an army. We're going to take time to train that army and make sure they're a disciplined fighting machine. and then we're going to head north. And so at this point, they recruit Anthony Wayne, veteran of the Revolutionary War, who takes a couple years to build his army, train them, stock the forts, get them prepared and ready to go. And they head north late summer of 1794 and face the Native Confederacy at a place called Fallen Timbers, just outside of Toledo, Ohio. It is here that the United States Army, after about 15 years or so, finally gets the upper hand on the Native Alliance. As a result of that conflict, these communities agree to come to the treaty table. So a year later, in 1795, they meet in Greenville, sign the Treaty of Greenville, which is the first time that the Myamis and other nations agree to cede or give up their land, some of their lands, to the United States. So if you didn't recognize any of the features on this map to begin with, beginning with Greenville in 1795, you might start recognizing things. In this treaty, the alliance agrees to give up about 2/3 of what's going to become the state of Ohio, parts of what are going to become southern Indiana and Illinois, little pieces essentially around existing forts that the U.S. also wanted access to. But this is going to begin a process over the next 45 years where all of this landscape is going to fall out of the hands of Native people. So I'm going to go through a series of slides pretty quick just to show how fast this can happen. But the thing to remember is, with Greenville, with basically every treaty that Native nations agreed to with the U.S. always said, just give us this. We'll live in peace. We won't ask for anything more forever. Does anybody like sappy R&B love songs? Because how long does forever last? Not long. In this case, it lasted about 8 years. As they gave up these lands, citizens kept pushing into Native lands. The American military kept supporting them, kept defending their citizens who were not supposed to be squatting and trying to settle on these Native lands. So 1803, 4, 5, we see more parcels of land that are ceded in treaties. 1809, 18 teens, 1820s, 1830s. So we get to 1838 with a treaty. All of this that had been Miami land, that little block right there is all they have left. So they're trying, and we're in the 43rd year of this at this point, from 1795 to 1838. Every year the Miamis are doing everything they can to hold on to any bit of their homelands they can. So they sign this treaty in 1838 and say, okay, this is kind of it. This is where we make our last stand. But the Americans kept pushing it around them, pressuring them. And so in 1840, facing really the annihilation of their community, the end of their community, tribal leaders said, we'd like to keep our people intact. We'll give you the rest of our land, and we'll move west. Because in 1830, the Indian Removal Act was pushed through Congress by Andrew Jackson, which had really kind of been informal American policy up to that point, but with that act in 1830 became the American policy to say we want to remove all Native peoples east of the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi. And so they just kept pushing. So in 1840, the Miamis agreed to give up this last remaining portion of their homelands and move west to save their community.
Is that about Fort Wayne?
So Fort Wayne's still right up about in here. So they were a little separated from that at this point. A little north of Indianapolis, yeah. But what this treaty stipulates is that what the Miamis will do is they will take the next 5 years, they will settle their current debts, settle their estates. They got to kind of, close out the business in the homelands. They ask for 5 years to do this. Once that's all taken care of, they'll head west. 5 years comes and goes. They haven't moved. Why? Because they don't want to. They don't want to leave. This is their home. They don't want to leave it. In fact, what they're doing over these 5 years is they are petitioning the U.S. government for exemptions from this removal. Because throughout the treaty process, throughout several of these treaties, individuals who were citizens of the Myaamia Tribe actually gained American title to some of this land. So it was not communal reservation land, it was privately held land. And they said, well, okay, I have the right to stay here because I own this land. And I got a couple hundred acres, and you want me to be a good American citizen now, so I'm going to need help planting crops, harvesting crops, taking care of animals. So can I get exemptions for some of my family to stay here with me? And the government granted many of these. So by 1846, they had about 150 or so exemptions for folks who would be allowed to stay in the homelands. But as 1846 rolled on, the U.S., losing its patience, decided no more. It's time to go. So in September of 1846, about a year after they had promised they would be gone, the U.S. once again sends the military into central and northern Indiana. They start rounding up Miami people at gunpoint, holding them in pins. And on October the 6th in Peru, Indiana, as depicted on the painting here, at gunpoint, they start forcing them onto canal boats to leave their homelands. So October 6th, load them up in Peru. They make their way through Fort Wayne on the Wabash and Erie Canal. They get up to what's now Defiance, Ohio, transfer over onto the Miami and Erie Canal. Start making their way south, a little bit north of Dayton. They pass through what's already been established as Miami County. That canal starts paralleling the Miami River. Just south of Dayton, they pass through what's already been established as Miamisburg. They get farther south, start making their way through Butler County on the 11th, come within about 12 miles of Miami University. All of these places bearing their name, and they're being forced to leave. So they get to Cincinnati on the 12th, transferred onto a riverboat, make their way down the Ohio to the Mississippi, north to St. Louis, transfer onto another riverboat across the Missouri, over to a place called Kansas Landing, a place we know as Kansas City. They get off the boats there, off the boat there, at that point it's just one riverboat. Get off the boat there and move south about 50 miles or so to the reservation the government has promised them. This reservation at the time was located in what was often referred to as the unorganized territory. So it was a territory of the U.S. that hadn't been divided into anything really yet, but soon after they get there, that territory is divided into the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. They end up in the Kansas territory, which both of those territories are seeking statehood. They soon get it. And all of a sudden, now in the state of Kansas, they have all the problems they had here that they had back here. These new settlers of these new states wanted native people out of the way.
How many people did they move in this?
On the removal for the Miami is about 325.
320.
Yeah. And on that journey, 7 folks died. 1 community elder, 6 youth. They get to what would become their new reservation and what would become Kansas the first week of November of 1846. Winter's about to set in. They have no homes, no food, and they're told to rebuild their community. And they do. They make it through that first winter. They start to reestablish themselves. About 24 or so people die that first winter. So overall, in the course of those 6 months or so, they lose about 3 dozen or so of about 10% of the population that left. But they rebuild their lives. They rebuild their community. And they are starting to really get their feet under themselves again. Till 1867. 21 years after having been forced there, now the state of Kansas is surrounding them. People are once again squatting on their lands, cutting their timbers, diverting their water, using up all their resources, and they want them gone. So in 1867, they are forced into a second treaty of removal where they're going to leave what is now the state of Kansas, head down to the northeast corner of what at the time was referred to as Indian Territory, that we know today as the state of Oklahoma. So that is where the government of the Myaamia Tribe still exists today, in the city of Myaamia, Oklahoma. So I should have brought this up at the beginning. A couple quick notes on pronunciation. So Brian nailed it when he did the introduction. Myaamia, their traditional name for themselves, Myaamia. But that is what got corrupted into what we know as Miami. But in Oklahoma, I think just because it's Oklahoma, they say Myaamia. So it's Myaamia, Oklahoma, Miami University, Myaamia Tribe, but they refer to themselves as Myaamia. So this map I just throw up because the Myaamia Tribe today numbers a little over 7,000 citizens, with 3 main population areas, the largest one in and around Myaamia, Oklahoma. A lot of folks still in the location of the original removal in eastern Kansas. A lot of folks still live, families who had those exemptions back in the 1840s. A lot of their descendants still live in and around Indiana. But we know of Myaamia people in 49 of the 50 states. So they describe the population as living in diaspora, in large part beginning because of these 2 eras of forced removal. So from the signing of the first treaty, Greenville, 1795, through the era, what year was Miami University chartered? 1809, just 14 years after the land had been ceded to the U.S., the university's chartered. Through 1809, through the removals in the 1840s and 1860s, the university chartered in 1809 had no contact with the tribe whose name they carried. And they did not have any until 1972. The first contact came in 1972 when some faculty and students in Oxford approached this guy. Anybody know who that is? Phil Shriver, president of the university from 65 to 81. Is that what I wrote? Oh, look at that. All right, good. And they said, President Shriver, you know, our university has this mascot. We've got this nickname that Native people across the country are telling us is insulting, that it does not accurately represent them. In fact, it entirely misrepresents them, and we should get rid of it. President Shriver said, let's look into this. Let's check this out. So he puts together a committee, and the committee's charged with a couple things. Essentially, is the mascot okay? What do Native people think of this mascot? What's our relationship? What's our university's relationship with Native people? And one thing they quickly find out is that the university had no relationship with Native people. There were no Native students on campus, no Native faculty, no Native staff, no Native nobody on Miami University's campus. But to get a better handle on this mascot, they said, hey, let's contact that tribe, the Myaamia Tribe. Let's see what they think. So the committee tracks down this guy, Forrest Olds, chief of the Myaamia Tribe out in Oklahoma. They send him a letter that July, I think July. Basically, I'm not reading the letter, so I'm paraphrasing. But basically says, hi, we're with Miami University. We've got this nickname we understand Native people aren't real fond of. What do you think? So, I said it a lot more informally than the letter did. And Chief Olds responds pretty quickly. And he says, well, I suppose if you can use it in an appropriate manner, it's okay. However, this name you're using, Redskins, you're not talking about just the Miamis. You're talking about all Native people. So we need to have a bigger discussion because it's not just us you need to talk to. And so the university says, we can use it. And they work out a deal with the tribe. They get the tribe's agreement to use it. But what they want to do is, at the time in the early 70s, there was some pretty horrific imagery of Native people there that was being used. Images of drunken Indians, images of Native people on the warpath, and among the concerns people were bringing up was about these stereotypes that were being created and how inaccurately they portrayed Native people. And the university said, we're going to clean this up. We'd like to keep the name, so we're going to try and make it more accurate and appropriate. And among the efforts to make it more accurate and appropriate was commissioning John Ruthven to paint the Miami Indian in 1974, I think. So that was, and then the head of that Indian, the head and two feathers, kind of became one of the new logos of the university. We can look back on that now and say the problem is no Miami Indian ever looked like that guy. That is a very stereotypical image of a Plains Indian. Not at all in any way related to how any Miami person ever looked. But the university was trying. And they had the tribe's agreement to work through this. They worked on it for a couple decades until the tribe finally came back and said, we don't think this is working. Would you just get rid of it? And the university agreed. So at this point, it's 96 when the tribe officially asked them to discontinue using that. I think it was just a month or two later at the next Board of Trustees meeting, the trustees voted to do just that. And so since then, the university athletic teams have a new nickname, Red Hawks. But it all began with kind of what some folks would consider a long process, beginning in 1972 and not really culminating until the mid-90s. But if you work with Native people, you come to find out that they don't like to do things overnight. They like to get to know people and see how well they can work with them. And they like to say that this relationship really grew organically. There was nothing forced about it. And that over time, as they got to know the university, as the university got to know them, as they appreciated where each other were coming from, eventually the time came for those changes to happen. So among the other things that the committee was looking at was not only the mascot and the relationship with indigenous people, was, okay, there's no Native people here in Oxford. What can we do to recruit indigenous students to come to this university? And hopefully, specifically, Miami tribal students to come to this university. So they started throwing around ideas about financial aid opportunities and scholarships and what else they could pull together to help recruit Native students. And this took a little while too, but in 1991, the first group of students from the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma, a group of 3, made their way to Oxford. This last year, we had 45 tribal students on camp. This last year, we're still in the middle of the year. This school year, we got 45. But standing at the podium here in his regalia and sitting here is Floyd Leonard, who was the chief of the Myaamia Tribe for 28 years or so, beginning in late 1974. After Chief Olds got that letter in the summer of 72, a month or two later, he was actually already scheduled to be in Cincinnati for a conference. He was one of the heads of the Northeast Oklahoma Electric Cooperative. And there was an electrification conference in Cincinnati that he was already planning to attend. So he got to Cincinnati in 72, and I don't know what he was thinking, but I think what he was thinking was, that Miami University place is just up the road. I'm going to go say hi. He didn't tell anybody he was coming to say hi. He just got in the car and drove to Oxford. But he found his way to Rowdebush Hall, to the office of President Shriver, knocked on the door, said, hi. Forrest Olds, chief of the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma. But President Shriver didn't know he was coming, so he wasn't there. But they did real quick, they're like, oh, well, we got the chief. We got to do something. So they gave him a quick tour of campus, invited him to come back, which he got a chance to 2 years later in 74. He got to meet President Shriver in person. Unfortunately, he returned to Myaamia, Oklahoma after that trip, and about 2 months later had a stroke and passed. But he set the stage. And on his passing, Floyd Leonard was elected chief and essentially just grabbed the baton from Chief Olds and kept running. So he's here introducing the first class of students. In 1991, in 2000, when the tribe came to the university to ask for help with this language revitalization effort, one of the big proponents was Myrtis Powell, standing here with the chief. And she had been kind of essentially the liaison for the university to interact with the tribe. And I wasn't at the meeting, but in the meeting notes, it's pretty clear that when tribal officials asked the university for help, and they were kind of considering it, that in the notes it talks about Myrtis Powell saying, well, if it's going to happen anywhere, it should happen right here. And that helped the university along. I don't know if it helped them. Maybe they were already leaning in that direction, but maybe it solidified the university's willingness to help in that. So 2 of the big players right there in helping establish what the tribe and university really have today. So one of the things, so I mentioned the center started primarily on language revitalization efforts. So a lot of folks like to ask, okay, well, if nobody was speaking the language, how do you learn it? Luckily, what the tribe had was a vast amount of archives to pull from. So the first contact with Miami and Illinois people began in the late 1600s, primarily Jesuit missionaries who were working in the Great Lakes trying to convert native people to Christianity. In the process, those missionaries were intensively documenting the language. I would say not out of the goodness of their heart, not, just to keep a record of it, but primarily to learn the language because it was probably easier, they thought, to convert the native people if they spoke their language. But in the process, they kept a great record of the language. But really continuing right up until some of the last speakers in the mid-1900s, we have a vast amount of archives of the Miami language that they've been able to go back into and pull from to relearn the language. Unfortunately, some of those really old ones look like this. And trust me, it's not just that it's kind of a small image that you're having trouble reading it. This is actually a ledger-sized page. This comes from what's known as the Pinet Dictionary, which was unknown when this language process started. But several of these were known. But I love to hear this story from the guy who directs the language office, David Costa. He talks about how they're really just trying to go through any archive they could to find any documentation on the Miami language. And a friend of his, who was Michael McCafferty, who works over at IU, who is an Algonquian language scholar. So Miami is one of the languages in the Algonquian language family, which includes Shawnee, Kickapoo, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and several others. But McCafferty was up in Montreal, actually just outside of Montreal, a little town called Saint Jerome, going through some Jesuit archives. And he's communicating with Dave, and they don't know that there's anything. Actually, he asks the archivist up there, got anything Myaamia? Like, no, we have nothing noted in the records that relates to the Miami language. He says, okay. So he gets done with whatever he's, his own research, and on the way out, the archivist said, and again, I'm paraphrasing all this. I wasn't there. But essentially the conversation went, anything we can do for you before you leave? He says, are you sure you don't have any Miami stuff? Because my friend Dave wants me to find some Miami stuff. And I said, well, we don't have anything identified as Miami, but we've got this file in the back that nobody really knows what it is. You want to look at it? He goes, yeah, sure. Why not? So he goes back, starts flipping through this file they pull out, and he's looking at it, and he's like, it's definitely in Algonquian language, but he's not a Miami guy, so he doesn't know if it's Miami or not. So he asked Dave, what should I look for? Is there anything in particular I should look for in here that might give me a clue? And Dave says, if you can find the word for corn, minjipe, that's a very specific Miami word that no other language uses for corn. If you can find the word for fox, papangamwa, that's a very specific Miami word that no other language uses for fox. If you can find the numbering system, because the Miami number 8, they borrowed from the Siouan language. So it really stands out as a very different term. So McCafferty goes back through and he's like, Minjipe, Papangamwa. I think this is Miami. He calls Dave, says, I got Minjipe and Papangamwa. Dave says, that's Miami. Give me a copy. 600 pages of documents dating to some of the very first contact with these communities. So before the language got corrupted by the French and the British. So just an amazing storehouse of documents to pull from. All of those first 4 documents there, from Allouez to Boulanger, about 1,300 pages total of really early language documents that they could pull from. So just this great treasure trove of material. This picture here, this is actually Darrell Baldwin, the director of the Myaamia Center. He is looking at some typewritten pages. He was him and Dave and Julie Olds, who was the cultural resource officer for the tribe out in Oklahoma, kept crossing paths with each other. Like in the mid-90s, they're all working on the language. They didn't know each other. But as they kept looking for more, they kept running across each other. And what had inspired Darrell was after his grandfather had passed, he'd left his belongings, and his dad handed off his grandfather's stuff to him. And Darrell's flipping through there, and he finds these typewritten pages on this like old onion skin paper. And he's flipping through there, and he's like, what's this? One column, clearly English. The next column, clearly not. And all of a sudden it dawns on him, that's our language. He's got like 18 or 20 pages of typed documents his grandfather had left. And so he's like, okay, well, if this is what we've got in the family, what else is out there? So between Dave and Daryl and Julie Olds, they are like crisscrossing Oklahoma, Indiana, Ohio, everywhere in between. Montreal eventually, archives in Philadelphia, trying to dig up any document they can on the Miami language. So they end up with this treasure trove of stuff to pull from. But still, okay, you're not speaking it. Now you've got it written down. And I mean, a lot of this written down very phonetically. Miami was not a written language. So when the French and the British and others are writing it down, they're writing it down in their own languages, how they think they hear it. So no, essentially none of these folks who are writing it down are writing it the same. Okay, nobody speaks it. We've got it on paper, but how do you pronounce these things? Luckily, a lot of language speakers survived in Shawnee communities, in Ojibwe communities, in Ottawa communities, Algonquian language speakers. Miami folks went to them and said, okay, this is written out phonetically. How would you pronounce this? Because this is as close as we're going to get. And so working with other language communities, they started to piece their language back together. So what happened coming out of that, and again, a little conversation I was having with a few folks beforehand was, you may have recently seen the news that the center got a $2.1 million grant to continue language revitalization efforts. And what that really is going to do, it's not just specifically for the Myaamia Tribe, but it's going to help us with working with other tribal communities on their language revitalization over the next 5 years or so. Because really that's going to what's known as the National Breath of Life, which is a program started at the Smithsonian that we now house at the Myaamia Center. And with that, we're working with tribal communities across the country who are also reconstructing their languages from archival sources, who don't have speakers. But they've seen what the Myamis have been able to do in the last 30 years or so and kind of see that as a model for how they can bring that into their communities as well. So Center was founded in 2001. In 2005, the work was happening so fast. In 2005, the first dictionary was published. As soon as it was published, it needed updated. I mean, the work was going that fast. And so eventually they started working on the possibility of, instead of printing dictionaries, creating an online dictionary. And the presence of the Myaamia Center on Miami University's campus provided access to computer science and engineering students who could help them build just that. So a lot of non-native computer science students have earned their degrees helping the Myaamia Tribe build language capacity within the community. So if you just, yeah?
In building the digital archive, are they all?
Yes. So there are pronunciation guides, and all of those documents they found going back to the 1670s, it's not just creating a dictionary, they're uploading those documents into that. So folks can see that original phonetic spelling of it. And this is not, that part of the archive is not available to the public. That's restricted to researchers and community members who are specifically working on the language. But yeah, a lot of that is included in here. But if you just get on Google and type in ILDA, ILDA, it'll take you to the Indigenous Languages Digital Archive. And you can go to the dictionary, you can go to the Miami Dictionary, pop in a word in English. If we know the word in Myaamia, you'll get a list of results. If you know the word in Myaamia and want to know its English translation, type it in, you'll get a list of results, if we have that word. But because of this work, and they had to build this because there was really no resource that they could use to do this work. Nobody ever tried this before. And so this is where working with those computer science and engineering students on campus really provided the advantage to be able to build this stuff from scratch exactly how they needed it to be. But yeah, so it started out, I don't know if you can read from back here or back there, but here it says Miami, Illinois. This database actually started as MIDA, the Miami, Illinois Digital Archive. But now with so many other tribal communities using it, they've changed the name to ILDA, the Indigenous Languages Digital Archive, to recognize all of the communities who are now using it, not just the Miamis. Yeah?
So, arts and sciences.
It's not taught to that extent. So it's not going to cover a foreign language requirement. No.
Thank you.
Yeah, no. We're not there. So, but that's a great question.
Next year, right?
Yeah, maybe next decade or century. Which is actually, the time frame of it. Several folks, Daryl Baldwin's been at this as long, if not longer than anybody. And folks ask him, oh, so you're fluent in the language? And he says, no, I'm not. I just started learning this 30-some years ago. It took 300 years to take the language away from us. It's probably going to take 300 years for us to get it back. So it's going to be a really long process. So we're not going to be covering foreign language requirements for some time, probably. But that's a great question. With this ability to work with multiple communities, we've got tribes, so that grant we just got is going to go a long way in including other tribal communities in this effort as they relearn their traditional languages. So, how am I doing on time, Brian? Okay, all right. He shouldn't have told me that. So I mentioned the revitalization really started with language, and it's expanded to multiple other aspects of culture, because one of the things that was being uncovered as they're learning the language, they're going back through all these written documents, and they're not just learning the language, they're learning about their culture from 300 years ago. And so they're revitalizing multiple aspects of this. So one of the things is lacrosse is a game that originated in native communities in the eastern part of North America. We have documentation of games of lacrosse being played in celebrations, to celebrate a marriage, in mourning, when someone dies, having a game in their honor, games that might take days or weeks to end, and potentially hundreds of people involved in the game. So pretty intense games of lacrosse. That's being brought back into the community. Stomp dancing. We just went out 4 weeks ago. The Myaamia Tribe hosted their winter gathering. It's a social event they do at the end of January every year. We had about 100 folks from Oxford head out to the winter gathering. Stomp dancing, these social dances, is a big part of community activities. Storytelling has been brought back into the community because some of the language was in stories that had been written down over the years. So all of these different pieces of culture that have been rediscovered through just really trying to learn the language. So a lot of different things are coming back into the community. If you've been around Oxford, on campus at all, maybe other places, you may have seen information about the revitalization of ribbon work. It's a traditional art form that tribal citizens would use to decorate clothing and other things. Essentially, it's kind of taking material, folding it, layering it, cutting it, sewing it in very specific patterns. And multiple tribal communities in the Great Lakes area make ribbon work or have made ribbon work. But for the Myamis, their patterns were typically geometric patterns, often with a focus on diamond patterns that would come out in their ribbon work. And so we've seen this revitalization of ribbon work pictured here on some leggings, here on some moccasins, and they call it the shimmering. The name for the ribbon work translates to the shimmering because when you look at the alternating colors of the diamonds, the light changes, and it has this kind of effect of shimmering where things look like, it's lighting up, essentially. But this kind of got kicked off in a lot of ways about 25 years ago now. So how many of you are sustaining members of your local PBS station? How many of you, even if you're not a sustaining member, have heard of Antiques Roadshow? Okay. So folks bring stuff in to the appraisers. They say, oh, I found this painting in the dumpster behind the Goodwill. What is it? Oh, it's a Picasso. It's worth millions. Or that's some kid's color by number. Throw it away. That's why it was in the dumpster behind the Goodwill. So in 2000, this guy brings these leggings, these moccasins, onto Antiques Roadshow. And the appraiser takes a look at them. The appraiser says, so, what do you have? The guy said, well, I just picked these up at an estate sale. And they had some newspaper clippings with them. And according to all of the information in here, this is Miami ribbon work, and it belonged to Little Turtle. Chief of the Miami, who made a habit of kicking the snot out of the American military. He's like, one, is it Miami? Two, was it Little Turtles? And the appraiser says, yeah, that's Miami ribbon work. No, it's not Little Turtles. Because Little Turtle died in the fall of 1812. And based on the material in this ribbon work, it's old. It dates to the 1820s and 30s is when it was made, but that's a decade or two after the turtle died. However, in this picture, this guy right here, wearing those leggings, wearing those moccasins, that's Little Turtle's great-grandson. And sitting next to him is his mom, Little Turtle's granddaughter. So he's like, it was in the Turtles family. It wasn't his, but it was his grandkids. And this kind of set off an uproar in the Myaamia community because we've got a picture of the family wearing it from 1908 or so, maybe 19-teens. But soon after this picture was taken, they were lost. They disappeared from the community. And nobody really knew what happened to them for almost 100 years. And what appears to have happened to them is Kilsaqua, the lady sitting down, and her son, Wapi Mangwa, they probably traded those with a local doctor who had providing medical care for them, and they didn't have money to pay him. He said, I'll take the ribbon work. And it was in his family and handed down until the estate sale that guy bought him at. So I'm trying to, I think the appraiser's like, I don't even know if the guy told him how much he paid for it, but I don't think it was much. But folks, Myaamia folks, they're like, can we see those? They get a hold of Antiques Roadshow and they're like, can you get us in touch with that guy? And can we take a look at those? And they said, no. Yeah, probably some kind of privacy agreement or contract or something. They can't just give away anybody's information. And they said, besides, he doesn't even have them anymore. He got it appraised at $8,000, walked out the door and sold it. But it was the Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto that bought it And they said, yeah, you can take a look at them. They were able to bring those pieces from Toronto to Oxford to the Art Museum for an exhibit on ribbon work in February of 2020. The exhibit opened, and a week or two later closed. So few people really got to take a look at them. But the Miamis got to take a look at them. And essentially, what they've been doing as they've been able to reconnect, in some cases repurchase some of this ribbon work, they've essentially had a chance to kind of reverse engineer it and rediscover how it was made 200 years ago. And that has helped in the reintroduction of that into the community today. So I think I mentioned at the start the Myaamia Tribe is one of 574 sovereign tribal nations within the boundaries of the United States. So some folks are shocked to learn that Indians are even still alive, let alone that there are 574 sovereign tribal nations of Native people still within the United States. So they essentially have a status more or less equivalent to a state. So they're kind of on par with states when it comes to their relationship with the United States. So their land, their reservation lands, the lands that they have in trust, they have dominion over. Their laws rule there. That's why on native land they can open casinos. That many states also do that now. But they're sovereign tribes. They decide what happens on their land. So the Myaamia Tribe out in Oklahoma, they have their own police department. They have their own court system. They have Myaami Nation Enterprises that runs a dozen or more businesses on behalf of the Myaamia Tribe that helps bring in income to the tribe that they use to support their citizens. They have various kind of social benefits. So they have a tribal burial ground that all citizens get burial, death benefits. They also have to deal with environmental issues. So soon after the Myamis and other tribal nations were removed to what would become northeast Oklahoma, a lot of mining started taking place that has left a devastated landscape. A lot of heavy metals have entered the water sources in the area. So tribe has an environmental office that has to work with state and federal governments to try to clean up those. They issue their own license plates and tribal IDs. So unfortunately, sometimes they have to post no harvesting advisories in some of the areas impacted by the heavy metals in the water. So they're doing everything any other government would do. On a smaller scale, but anything any other government would do. They have all of those things for their citizens and the surrounding communities. That brings me to my last slide, where actually I think it's my next to last slide. But if you're interested in more information, I can share these websites with Brian. I don't know if he'd be interested in sending them out to the membership. But speaking of membership, and since I've been listening to my PBS NPR station all week with their membership drive, I just renewed my membership to the Butler County Historical Society on my way in the door. So if you're not a member, take my word for it. You get to come to these for free, like Brian said. But if you're interested in more information, we have a series of webinars online. There's 6 one-hour kind of mini documentaries that discuss the language effort, the homelands, where the tribe is today. The Achimo Tatiangwe is what we refer to as the Myaamia community blog. There are sections there. There's a history section, education section, ecology section. It's posted to at least once a week with a lot of different pieces of Myaamia history and what the tribe's up to today. So feel free to check those out. If you get has anybody seen this bus around Hamilton? All right. So on the side of one of the BCRTA buses, it says Aya, which when I introduced myself, I said Aya Cheke. Hello, everybody. Aya is hello. So hopefully you see that around. If you get to Oxford, there are some pieces by tribal artists in the Richard and Carol Cox Art Museum on campus, so you can check that out. So feel free to check all of that out. And if you're interested in supporting the work of the center, so they still have them up there. Yep. So was everybody able to get the, okay. So then I want to say Mishinewe, which literally means big thanks, but we often interpret as thank you very much. And for all of you Miamians out there, Tapa Lindiani, Nahitehiane, love and honor. But I'm happy to take any more questions. So, all right, thanks.